comics production and publication. I'm Jay Gonzo, comic creator, I want to say. And I've also been a graphic designer for 30 years. I've done graphic design, production work for the likes of Image Comics and like a bunch of other places. I don't know. I'm not going to get into me. I'm just here to moderate. So anyway, with me, joining me are other comic creators. This is Crystal Gonzalez. This is Javier Solórzano and Barbra Dillon of Fanbase Press. Crystal and Javier both self-publish. Barbra runs a publishing company? A publisher, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. So we get a nice, well-rounded view of how comics can work. You can come in, please do. Oh no, she peeked in here. Whatever. Yeah, come on in, hang out, whatever. Okay, or not. Anyway, I just wanted to get everyone to get starting with Crystal. Let's go down the road. Let's get a brief history of your relationship with publication and production. I think you push the button or click it. Maybe not. Did you just touch the switch and then not turn it off?
I did not touch the switch.
Oh, okay. Uh-oh.
Push it out.
There you go. Hello? Okay, great. My name's Crystal Gonzalez. I've been self-publishing a comic book called In the Dark. It's an ongoing series since it started in 2008, so until now. I haven't done the math exactly, but long time. I do a black and white comic book. It's a combination of also animations. I'm also an animator.
And you do everything, correct? Write and draw? Yep.
Yes, and I do everything. I'm the writer, the drawer, the
production manager?
The production, the marketing.
Yep, there you go.
My name is Javier Solórzano. I am the creator of Super Lucha Cats, which is a comic book about lucha libre cats fighting monsters. And before that, I wrote and drew a comic book called Muchísimo. And I have no relationship with publishing. This is all I'm flying by the seat of my pants here, so.
But you do all the production on everything, right? Like,
I do all of it. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So that's self-publishing. That is publishing. It's
correct.
Okay, there you go.
Bethany? Oh,
Bentley, like the car.
Bentley.
Excellent. Yeah.
Okay, very
I like
cool.
that. Come on in, guys. Have a seat.
Bentley.
We just started. We're introducing people.
Absolutely. So I'm Barbra Dillon. I'm the editor-in-chief and co-founder of a publishing company called Fanbase Press. And we have sort of a dual nature. We've been in business since 2010, and we not only publish comics, but we also support through promotional means other creators as well, even if they're not within our stable of creators. Because for us, it's a rising tide in the comic community, so we can all help one another rather than competing against one another. So we do daily reviews, interviews, podcasts, everything. And our most known book, I would say, is Quince, which is about a young woman who gets superpowers on her quinceañera, but only for the year she's 15, and it was Eisner nominated in 2018.
Right on. Cool. All right, I'm going to jump into, I'm imagining, so we're not going to talk about, like, drawing comics or creating comics, like the art part of it, the story part of it, like that's another panel. We're here to talk about production, publication. Rubber meets the road. You have your idea, you've got your comic, like let's turn it into an actual thing that you can hold. And so I wanted to just ask you guys, when you start a project, are you thinking format first, story later? Do you start with story and then figure out what format works for? Like, how does format fit into what you do? And just for you guys who may or may not know, comics can be mini comics, digest size, like floppy issue size, trade paperbacks. You can do issue. Are you thinking issue wise? Are you thinking about collecting it in trade? OGNs, kind of original graphic novels, all of those. So how much does format come into play with what you like when you're starting a project? We'll start with Crystal and work our way down again.
So basically, I guess the idea began, and it kind of all percolated into writing first. Writing and then thumbnailing, and the writing kind of helped create the formatting, so to speak. Because,
so when you're thumbnailing, are you thumbnailing to a certain proportion or just what feels right?
Basically to a certain proportion, only because, like for instance, in my first book, I kind of went really novelly, and some of the panels, especially the word bubbles, have a lot of text.
Okay.
A lot of text. I'm super text heavy. Because I'm talking a lot of the stories being told, and a lot of these characters just go on rants. So, so when I was kind of formatting it, I wanted to make sure that I had nice big spaces in order to create a lot of wording in there. But then as I kind of began to evolve, I realized a lot of people don't like to sit and read that much. They have to kind of cut it down a little bit,
Gotcha.
So come the second book, I realized that you got to put just enough sentences, and then you move on to the next panel and the next panel without over-indating, when you don't want to get too boring, I guess.
Yeah, just somewhere on the thumbnail part is when you're like, oh, it's going to be square format or rectangular, kind of landscape, what have you. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
exactly.
And you guys, just to understand, like thumbnailing are small, tiny drawings of what the page layout's going to look like. Some people, like myself, I'll do all 22 pages of a comic book on one single sheet of paper so I can see the rhythm of the comic. And the ones that you were talking about, like you'll see that, like, oh, there's a lot of talking that happens here and then a bunch of action here, maybe if I switch some stuff around.
True, and then when it comes to the actual panels themselves, based on what's happening in the actual moment of the story, I might get organic. So like there's moments where perhaps they're having an epiphany about something. There's going to be like cloud bubbles and weird like shaped panels that kind of melt and look like they're turning into fire and stuff. The story involves a guy stuck in the underworld, so there's lots of like demons and things. So it's not always clean panels. Sometimes they break out of those panels.
And then real quick, at what point, just before we move on, Javier, like what point, so format, you've made your page kind of size, like it's going to be a printed comic book, they're going to be single issues kind of when you have your story idea. Yeah. At what point are you making the black and white versus color decision?
So black and white, I kind of made a real solid decision on that because this is a horror graphic comic, and I'm really inspired by like Tales from the Crypt, creepy, eerie, just really hard black and white comics with lots of cross-hatching. Ink, for me, is very important when it comes to that black and white contrast.
So subject matter dictated the form, kind of. So once you do the story, you're like, oh, okay, cool. So what about you, Javier? Like, where do you?
Plus, I really like ink.
Oh, gotcha.
For me, it's just
like personal preference. Like, that definitely personal preference is so much a part of like format decisions.
Like if it, it's just like the organic kind of nature of the ink flowing around that makes that happen.
Javier, where do you make your format decision?
For me, it came really early. It was really important to me that it looked like a Marvel or a DC book that I was reading in the 90s, because that's when I was reading comics. So I literally just measured out my old Spider-Man and Batman comics, and when I reached out to the publisher, I just told them, what size bleed do you need for this? And then my thumbnails were proportioned to that, and then I just made sure that I limited like my splash pages to like my important moments, but beyond that, it's just the laying out the story in 3 acts and all that stuff.
Gotcha. So you were like, I'm going to make a comic book, and then you're like, now I'm going to put the story into it.
Right.
And then just a real quick aside about something he mentioned. You guys know, so bleed is the artwork itself extends beyond where you trim it to, right? So that all the edges, like, because if you try to cut right on the edge of the artwork, it doesn't work. So there's usually about 1/8 of an inch of bleed around everything. So you have your bleed edge, which is the actual maximum size that you're going to actually create artwork for. Just inside of that is where they trim the paper down. So anything beyond the trim mark doesn't get seen, gets trimmed off, but it makes for a nice edge. And then because that cutting can shift a little bit, you come in a little bit and you have a safe area. And those are dictated by different publishers. I would urge everyone, before you start a project, get your specs first. Like, figure out what they want resolution-wise, figure out what they want size-wise, if they want you to work to size. Well, nowadays with digital art, a lot of guys will just work to size. Like, it needs to be 6 3/4 by, or 6 6/8 by 10 1/4, 10 1/8, depending on the publisher, at 600 DPI, 300 DPI, whatever it is. But that's another thing too, small aside, sorry. Resolution and DPI aren't the same thing. DPI with a size is a resolution, or pixel by pixel is a resolution. Because you can have a 300 DPI image, but if it's only 1 by 1, you reproduce that at 8.5 by 11. Now it's going to the effective resolution on it's going to drop to like 3 DPI or something. So make sure your specs are clear in either a pixel by pixel dimension or a measurement by a resolution, or by a DPI. Sorry, and then any of these you guys have follow-up questions, any of this, I can explain it back at my table later. There's like a lot of info up, and I'm going to point people to some good resources too online in just a second here as well. So, sorry, I didn't mean to totally sidetrack. Sorry, were you done, Javier?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then so, Barbra, you're in an unusual case where you're getting stuff, and so do you, as a publisher, are you saying, hey, we want to make this square, like you can say it's like more square,
Right.
we want to make it more kind of digest size, like do you suggest that, or do your the people you work with, do they come to you with like, I made this square, I made this, how does that typically work for you?
Absolutely. So that's a good question. So for us, all of our the projects that we publish and choose to publish are based on submission. So we're very fortunate in that regard. But a lot of times they come to us in different formats because we are happy to talk to folks, if they have a germ of an idea, or if they have a script, or if they have their team. We've even had a book nearly finished in creation that we've published. So it really just depends project to project. As Jay mentioned, we have Kinsey, which is more, we call it amulet sized. This is more of a YA middle grade book, and if you're familiar with the Amulet series, that's a very popular book series for YA and middle grade readers. So we wanted something that was familiar to them size-wise, so they got that same feeling and comfortability. But it really does depend. A lot of times we will go with the standard comic book format, but the last thing I would say is that there's no one right way to do it. If you want to publish something that is circular, publish it circular. Make sure you get your specs. Make sure you chat
Make
with
sure
the
it can be
printer.
done.
Yeah, exactly. Make sure it can be done. But I think that's the fun thing about publishing comics is that there's no right or wrong way to do it. Sure, there are industry standards, but folks break the mold all the time, and they're huge successes. So don't let anything limit you.
You can also break the mold and become colossal, but like they can't, like physically can't rack your book or something
Sure.
like that. So you should have
Make
some respect
sure
for that.
it
But
can be
yeah,
done. Yeah.
but do what you want ultimately, unless you're working with a publisher. And then in that case, before you start any project, if you're working with someone, like if you're, so there's a difference between self-publishing and then working for a publisher. And the publisher will always have predetermined, like, this is what we do. And if you want to go back and forth and like, hey, I was thinking more square as opposed to rectangular, I want to go landscape, can we bind it on the, and their printer might not be able to bind it on the short side. Like some people just physically can't do that, or it's an extra cost.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I want uncoated paper as opposed to gloss paper. Some guys are like, well, that, like with Image, I wanted like a clay coat paper when I did my collected edition, and they were like, we can do that. It's going to take X amount out of your profit though, and then you can make informed decisions. So I think format before you start a project is always good, but it can be sorted out later. Just, try not to paint yourself into a corner where like, well, now I can only do the most expensive thing possible because I decided to make a circular book, and it has to be a custom die, and now everything has to be hand collated, all of these sorts of things. So, and again, I can explain all these terms later if someone has questions about it. So let's talk about printers. So we'll start with Barbra, especially because you're handling a variety of different creators and stuff. Do you have go-to printers, or do you go per project? How are you selecting a printer based on what it is you're doing?
Absolutely. So at this time, for the past few years, we've solely used Print Ninja. We're really happy with them. Their offices are based here in the U.S., but the printing and manufacturing and shipping is all done in China. So that's something, especially right now, and I would imagine you'd like to highlight as well, the fact that a lot of times you really want to, if you're up against deadlines, if there's a con that you really want to have a book for, make sure, again, in advance, once you know your specs, also talk to your printer about what kind of timelines they have, both for production, for shipping, and then another thing, unfortunately, with the pandemic to keep in mind is that there are paper shortages, especially in the comic book industry. Yeah. There are shipping delays right now because ports, the ships are
no one can guarantee a delivery date right now currently. No one will say you will have this by X date because there are so many X factors happening. So give yourself plenty of time, and if you're dealing with China, they'll have it done by whatever date they say by.
Sure. But
when that clears customs, it's a whole different story. So,
but I think that's something, sometimes folks have a specific printer that they really enjoy working with, but maybe it's great customer service, maybe it's the product quality, maybe it's a combination of the two. But another really big thing to keep in mind, and I'm sure that Crystal and Javier can speak to this as well, is how many copies, like what size of a print run are you going to be doing? Is it 20 copies? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Because really the cost of the books, printing them, is going to depend on that as well.
How you sourcing your printers, man?
So my first book, I used a print-on-demand service called Comics Wellspring, and they do really small runs of like 25, 30, 40 books. And that's great if you don't have a lot of upfront money because you're not paying for as many copies, but the trade-off is your cost per book is much higher. And so basically I did that for my first 2 comics, and that sort of was my trial by fire on like figuring out formatting, guidelines, file delivery, all that stuff. But for Lucha Cats, one of the big things for me was I wanted to bring the price down. I wanted it under $5, so the only way I could do that was doing an offset printing. And I used a printer that Gonzo is actually familiar with. They're in Arizona. They're called Ben Franklin Press. And they printed it all over there. I picked it up. So the upfront cost is higher, like in the thousands, but your cost per book drops like significantly.
Just to interrupt real quick here, just so you guys understand, so offset printing is plates turning onto paper, actual, it's the blanket that makes contact with the paper and not the actual, hence the offset. So you have to pay a press setup fee, but beyond the setup fee, once you start adding units, the difference between getting, you're kind of on the hook for X amount of dollars, usually like a $500 to $800 setup fee for your first 20 books even, but the difference between 20 and 1,000 is like $100 or something. And then if you start adding on to there, you really start increasing, or you're decreasing your kind of per unit cost. So if you're doing something like 5 to 1,000 or multiples of thousands, offset can really save you. Digital printing is basically like your version of like a printer at home. It's that where just inkjets or dye sublimation or G-Clay or whatever is basically making one at a time, using digital files to create that image as opposed to having plates that turn that actually make those. So just to clarify, sorry.
Correct.
Thank you.
And forgot what I was going to say, but
I'm sorry. Amateur.
Oh, right. So the big thing for me was bringing down the cost on the book, and my way to do that was paying for offset printing. On the plus side, though, is that this last issue, I got like 400 extra copies than what they were originally, what I was originally paying them for, because they have to
They
have
can
to run
calibrate
them,
their presses,
right?
so
They can't. We're not talking like tens of prints, we're talking like thousands at this point. So they gave me like 400 extra ones, and he was like, well, those are for the test run and they came out great, so they're yours now. Which is
usually
great.
with offset, you're going to end up with a lot of, because they have to bind them too, and their binder will, the thing that center stitches them and staples them, that'll eat sometimes eat like 100 or 200 of those just getting that calibrated or the fold right on those. So you can end up with hundreds more. You can end up like 50 more. With those, you're always going to get a little bang for your buck. With digital, they're going to print what they print, and you're going to get that amount usually. And then also with digital, you can't do uncoated paper because there's always going to be a fuser coat on there. That even if you do want uncoated paper, that fuser coat is going to give it like a sheen and stuff. So if you want like a natural uncoated kind of toothy paper, you kind of have to go offset. There's benefits. And then the real benefit of something like Ben Franklin is that press checks. You can go down and see what it's actually going to look like, which you can't do if it's coming from China.
Correct. They offered a press check, but I didn't want to drive over there for that. So
they're across town for me, so I drive down there.
They took photos of it, and I was like, that looks fine. But they did send me a sheet with all of the pages laid out on it for me to do a color check, so I could go in and be like, oh, the blue on Coco's mask looks right, but the blue on Pizza's sweater looks a little dark, which was one of the notes I gave them, and they were able to fix that, and it came out just the way I needed it to. Whereas with digital, you just get what you get. You get a PDF proof.
You get a version of the PDF you sent them, which I think is such a ridiculous note. It's like I send you a PDF as artwork, they send you a PDF back to oh, does this look right? Well, it looks like the PDF I sent you, so yeah.
Right. So if you're just getting your feet wet, print on demand is probably really good for you to learn formatting, printing process, but just be ready to not make as much per book, which if your goal is to make money, that's a different conversation.
Maybe become a banker? I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. yeah, if anyone's getting into comics to make a bunch of money, maybe don't. Sorry. But if this is an endeavor of love. I mean, I think, especially all of us up here, these things that we have are testaments to our love for the medium, and that's really what you're selling. You can smell the love coming off of things, as opposed. we're not Marvel. We're not doing cross money grabs. We can't do crossovers, or variant covers. So But But the cool thing about comics too is that you can just make comics. You don't need permission. There's no barrier to entry. So being successful, that's a whole other. That's not this panel. Sorry. And Crystal, for you, how are you sourcing printers?
So mine kind of started a little irregular or sort of different. Basically, I went into a master's program learning fine art. So I'm a fine artist, and I do large paintings and gallery showings. And the work that I did coincided with this massive story that this comic book is related to. And so the comic art itself, was something that was part of the gallery showings. And it actually, I had the giant, the original pages, 11 by 17s, presented on the walls as fine art pieces. And so issue 1 of the book was also an art item, a fine art item. So I went with, not the standard size, I went with a larger size. So I have like a 7 by 10.25 or something. It's just a little bit larger than the regular.
But it's such a, my trade paperback is in 7 by 10. Yeah, I do and that extra little half inch.
It does.
It really makes a huge difference.
It makes your art more clear. I don't know. There's something about it, but just a little bit larger. And then the first run of my issue 1 of In the Dark was an art book. So basically, it was like the finest quality covers, super gloss, extra UV gloss.
Did you source the printer on that? Did you have?
And I went to a local printer in San Francisco. I was, that's where I went to school, CCA, in San Francisco. And so I went to a local printer nearby. Kind of got an idea like how to make this book, this comic book. An art book. I basically I didn't go with the cheap paper and newsprint. I went with really thick, glossy paper and thick, glossy, exterior. The thing was golden, And I also included a CD with my animations from the gallery showings, and that was actually sold in the galleries for $35 a piece. And I sold them all, So, but I knew that long term, I didn't want my comic book to just be regulated to only the highest bidders inside galleries. I wanted people to be able to read it, regular people. I got to make it mass produced. So I had to. I talked to the same local printer, and that's kind of where I ended up making some deals with him. Kind of hey, if I keep you as my guy, will you be able to give me some discounts on the runs that I do with you? And he was like, yeah, you're going to be doing some big runs, and you actually picked some nicer papers, and
Yeah, I think a lot of times you can negotiate stuff out because print is kind of dying, and everyone's moving to China when they have to. So if you want to do something local, these guys would rather work than not work. And you can do things like margin runs too, where if they're running other projects and they have extra room in the margins, you can hey, just piggyback me on this other project, so all the setup fee gets eaten by the bigger client. And you
exactly.
Get to
so that's kind of what I had going with that printer in San Francisco. Unfortunately, like you were saying, the print world is kind of dying. His company went under.
Tell me about it.
6 years ago, and so I had to find another place, and I had to shop around quite a while to find something reasonable.
Definitely.
Cost-wise.
When it comes to getting anything done, shop around. Get more than one bid because it's amazing what. And some printers won't tell you stuff you'll be like, "Hey, can I get this done?" And they'll be like, "Yeah, that's it's going to be $3,000." And then they just tell you that that's the price, and you go to another printer, and they're like, "Yeah, that's going to be $2,800." But if you shave an eighth of an inch off here and there, we can get it all into 2 parent sheets, and then it'll cost you $1,500. And that first printer just didn't mention it to you because they wanted to make that money. The other one, so just definitely shop around.
You can kind of negotiate at least some of the costs.
And a good printer will help you kind of control the cost too. They'll give you options and be like, if this was self cover as opposed to a second cover or a separate cover or little things like that. And the self cover is when the inside pages are the same as the cover, which I don't really care for. But if you can save, if it's your first book and you just want to get it out there, you can do self cover and it'll save you a chunk of money because they don't have to set up the cover separate from the guts.
And being a self publisher, I didn't have to go down to the standard size. I still have a bigger book, So the comic book is still slightly larger, just because I always had a feeling that every page that you do, again, because I'm old school, I do traditional ink. I'm putting it in a bottle.
Oh, that was my next question. Sorry, we got to. I'm sorry. I kind of want to get to. I want to get to questions from them too. So are you working traditional? Are you working?
Yes.
2 size, or are you working 2 up, 1 up, 1.5 up? How do you?
So I'm doing. It's all traditional.
Okay.
It's Bristol 11 by 17s is the size of the Bristol.
Okay.
Nice, extra smooth, so that ink glides real nice. And I, because again I was a traditional painter, and I worked with charcoals and a bunch of other mediums and whatnot. Ink was my baby. And I am a painter, so I did it originally, like paintbrush, inkwell, paintbrush,
Gotcha.
paintbrush everything.
So, and then, so are you, since you're primarily black and white, do you work in grayscale when you start scanning and then manipulating it digitally, or do you work color when you scan?
I scan in black and white.
Okay.
But I scan it like
You
a
scan it like bitmap, like
600 DPI though.
I got a really good
600 DPI
resource
black and white.
on that aspect of this later on, so we'll get into those weeds in a minute. But then we'll jump back to hobby too with Barbara. So how do you set, like, do you get traditional, get digital? Like, are you at any point, do you get physical artboards that you then have to scan and then give to a colorist, or how is that? Or is it everything?
We've had, it's different project to project.
Okay.
Luckily, all of the folks that we've worked with come from graphic design backgrounds, so
Okay.
they do all of their own scanning. But to Kat's point, we've had folks that have done hand painted every single panel with acrylics and then scanned them in. We've had folks who do digital only. We've had folks who do hand painted, including grayscale. It really just depends on the creators coming to the project and what it calls for.
What are you typically giving to a printer? Are you sending PDFs? Are you sending like InDesign files? How do you usually?
Don't love InDesign.
Okay, I know a lot of people don't. Yeah.
Yes, but generally speaking, actually, Print Ninja prefers PDFs.
Okay.
They've moved in that direction, so we're very fortunate in that it's.
Are you sending single pages, or do you have to do printer spreads or reader spreads, or how do you?
They just take singular PDFs.
Okay.
Actually, yeah. So it's really, really functionally easy. Just
Gotcha.
getting it together and ensuring that when we do get to the proof, that it's like Javier said, like the colors are matching and it's looking
Gotcha.
like what we want it to look like. Yeah.
And then Javier, you're working color, right? So you work in RGB and then convert to CMYK before you send it over. You work in CMYK. How does it matter? Are you working traditionally, digitally? Let's start there.
So I work all digital.
Okay.
That was a decision I made very early on because I realized if I was going to be doing everything by myself, that meant I was going to have to put everything on Instagram by myself, YouTube, Facebook, and so I wanted to be able to recycle my assets, like my characters, without having to recut the background out every time. So I work everything natively in Photoshop at the moment. I'm trying to get to work on an iPad, which is a learning curve for me. And I hate InDesign with a passion. I hate it.
Coming from Quark and PageMaker, it's.
I hated it when it was PageMaker too. So I set up all of my flats in Illustrator, and I send individual Photoshop files for every page, and I send them.
Are they RGB or CMYK?
CMYK.
Okay.
Yeah, they're CMYK unflattened. I send font files. I send a separate sheet with Pantones if needed. But
You're calling out PMS colors to your CMYK breakdown?
no, not this last time. No. But that allowed me to then be able to take, like, I've reused the assets on this page hundreds of times at this point because I have those files on their own, separated from that page whenever I need to grab them. And that works for me, but I know a lot of people prefer ink and board, and I would too. I also don't have the room at home to keep stacks and stacks of
11 by 17s.
papers. Yeah, so
That's why I seldom at shows. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up to questions because we're getting a little tight on time. So do you guys have any questions? Anyone?
Don't be shy.
All right, cool. Well, I just wanted to
I
make
should
sure,
also
like-
say that my
Okay,
careers are
yeah.
done digital.
Oh, so-
Hello everyone. My name is Ivan. And I would like to know, like, what do you go to rhetorical devices that you use that, like, you feel like are gonna impact the reader the most, the ones that you like to use?
What was the question?
Oh, like what kind of like rhetorical devices? Like what kind of like storytelling? Kind of.
What kind are you like you go to? To try to like try to bring in the audience, the reader, as much as possible. Just make it feel immersed in your world.
You guys want to go? I mean, I got an answer
Well,
if you guys want to jump in.
wanna jump
I'm just moderating though.
Well, for me, the story itself that I was, concocting all centered around the characters themselves. So there was a lot of time invested in terms of like making sure that the characters themselves were very believable And so that when I was telling this story, it was almost like an organic sort of thing where I was like, yes, I know exactly how this character would respond, how this would happen if these events went on in the story. You know, what would be the way to go about it. But that had to do a lot with basically learning how to write and how to write a good story. So like, you know, for instance, when I was in college, I was taking art. I was also taking a minor in philosophy. Those books are intense, you know, but they have a lot of great ideas in them. But I was also taking a lot of courses in, you know, English literature and storytelling, like how to actually write, creative writing, and just learning like how to functionally tell a story from beginning to end, right? Beginning, middle, end. And it was very interesting because, you know, when I first started this, I only started at the beginning, and they're like, no, you need to know the end. You have to know the ending first. Because otherwise, you could just deviate as you continue to tell the story because you don't really have an ending yet, right? So when I was making this series, In the Dark, which is 7 issues, I'm on issue 4, that was laid out quite early. Like, I pretty much had an idea, and I wrote it all down. And now I'm kind of going through, and I actually pretty much penciled a lot of the thumbnails for the entire thing in like 12 sketchbooks, you know, like. And so technically it's done, the whole story's done, but it's just, you know, jumbled. It's just like, you know, scribbles that look like it's a beautiful mind, you know, no one's gonna read this and know what I'm talking about, you know, so it's just now a matter of like trying to translate it into the book, right? But I feel like not only was the story super important, the characters themselves were super important, and that all had to stem from writing experience.
Bobby, what do you go to? What's your go-to for
Oh, I was going to apologize because I realized that I called Crystal Cat and may have done so multiple times. So my apologies, Crystal Cat, on your son.
We'll dub that in later, right? We'll fix that in post. All right, perfect.
We'll fix it in post.
Yeah.
But I guess for me, since I myself am not a writer, but I'm the editor, and so it is very important for me that there is a cohesive story. Like Crystal said, that there are characters that are very impactful. And so for us, when we approach any story of whether we're going to take it on as a publisher, we look for 2 things. Is there a resonating character or characters with this story? And do they have an impact? I mean, there are lots of, and I love them myself and will read them endlessly. There are lots of stories out there that are just action or just like fluff stories, as we call them, which are necessary. You know, sometimes we just need an escape. For us at Fan-Based Press, there has to be a greater message at play. And, you know, it can be in the form of a superhero story. It can be in the form of a fantasy or sci-fi comic, but it has to have that resonating storyline, those resonating characters there as well. And so what I would say, if you yourself are a creator, a writer, just start with what are you trying to tell? Like, just like Crystal was saying, you know, have an endpoint. What is the bare minimum if you had 30 seconds to tell someone about your story? What is it that your story is really about? And if you have that in mind, that will guide you forward. Yeah,
so one area that I kind of found myself dipping back into was this allegory for this. Like the cats in my comic book kind of have to stay away and hidden, but they still have a job to do. And that reminded me a lot of like my neighbors growing up who maybe were undocumented immigrants and had jobs, but didn't necessarily feel safe going to places where there was a lot of cops. The guys in the second issue, they meet are werewolves, but they kind of look like cholitos, and growing up, you know, cholos and gang life aren't something you really look forward to as a kid. It kind of happens to you. And that's kind of a parallel story to a werewolf. None of those guys ever look out to be werewolves. It kind of just happens to them. And so that worked for me, just because I was able to draw a lot of those parallels with what I saw growing up and sort of the stories I wanted to tell. But something I think that Javier Hernandez actually told me when I first reached out to him was just like, tell your story. Because that's a story only you can tell, right? Regardless of how you want to tell it or what the character's name is, if you tell your own story, that's a story nobody else can really duplicate. So it's always helpful to look inward when writing those kinds of stories.
My quick advice on that, as a moderator, I always say, and this is something that kind of goes back to my advertising days, nobody cares about what you write in a comic book. Nobody cares about what you draw in a comic book. What they care about is how they feel about what you wrote and drew, right? So I always look for the emotional truth of a thing. Like, what do you want the character to, what do you want the reader to feel from this moment? How do those moments relate to the other? And then try to exemplify that from everything that's being said to how it's framed, to how it's colored, what the staging is on it, right? If someone's, feeling small, like literally, like draw them small in the panel. If someone's feeling powerful, draw them big. All of that goes into play. Like, you should be showing more than telling, and then the telling should kind of accentuate that. Or it can work in juxtaposition to that. But still, what is the emotional truth of every moment? What's the emotional truth of every 2-page spread? What's the emotional truth of the entire comic book? And if you can think about what you want them to feel, it's easier to figure out what you need to write or draw. So that's my quick answer. I think we're coming up close to the end. Do we have any more questions? Because I got one last question for these guys, and we can kind of maybe go out on that. And then I want to give you guys a couple of good resources for actual production and publication. So, what is the one thing you wish you would have known about production and/or publishing before you started that you now know?
One thing that I know,
Something you know now that you wish someone would have told you before you started this whole endeavor of making comics.
Oh, that's a good question. And you had big feet first?
I don't know. Actually, I mean, what do you got, man?
Okay, if you want to go first. I'm thinking.
Binding. I don't know if you can hear it. There it is. Binding. Please be really careful with the printer that you go with and the binding that they use. When we first started out, we went with a local printer because we had a deal with them in place, and so it was great. And then we got the binding, and the book started falling apart. Folks, I love reading a good comic. I want to open it up and see all of the art. I don't want to break it necessarily, but I don't want it to break without me doing it. So please, know what kind of binding you want, and know what kind of binding the printer can do. Very, very important to the longevity and just the quality of the books that you put out.
So this is going to be an instance of me telling you do as I say, not as I do. But
That's everyone up here for sure.
Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. It's something I wish I knew when I was beginning, because I have a bad habit of figuring out on my own. I really don't like bothering people. I always feel like I'm bothering somebody if I reach out with a question. I'm really sheepish about that. And it wasn't until after I did that first issue that I started talking to Javier Hernandez. I think Gonzo told me about Ben Franklin. I was like, I can get that stateside and not have to worry about shipping times. And there's real people when I call their phone. Like, those kinds of things that don't be shy about asking, because the people are more than willing to help you out. If you have, and I'm going to speak for myself, but if you have questions, feel free to come to my table and ask me. I will gladly tell you everything I had to deal with when I was doing this. But I say that knowing full well that when I work on my next one, I'm probably not going to ask for any help, because I do feel like I bother people, but that's just something that's like a mental hurdle.
I don't think anyone who's ever made a mistake doesn't want to save everyone else from that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's
so. If anyone has any kind of publication, any dumb, there's no dumb questions, right? Like,
right. There are no dumb questions.
Simple things, that I'm totally like, hey man, if you're, yes, the printer's rip is going to go ahead and approximate blacks, and so you can work in RGB and CMYK, but if you're bumping blacks up against each other, make sure they've got the same CMYK breakdown.
Right.
Or, like those sorts of things where it's like, so anyway, I'll answer those kind of questions till the cows come home.
Can I add something to that? I also have business cards with me, and I have more at our table in the corner as well. But to everyone's point, I am absolutely happy to answer any questions about any aspect of comics publishing that you'd like. If it's marketing, if it's production, if it's finding a team, if it's whether you want to self-publish versus reaching out to a publisher. Just pick up a card, email me. I'm happy to chat at any time. I may not get back to you in the 24 hours, but I will absolutely get back to everyone. So please, like Javier said, do not hesitate to reach out. This is the friendliest community and the most helpful. Yeah. So we are absolutely.
We all want to spare everyone some
yes,
pain here. So,
yeah.
And then real quick, because we're kind of winding down. Chris,
I thought of something. Okay, there's two things pretty much that I learned. 2-page spreads. Oh my gosh. I have a 2-page spread in here of this giant pig demon that is addicted to Starbucks coffee. He's super detailed. And I realized that there is a very finite way to line those up so that when you print, he doesn't look like half his belly is slightly adjacent, like he's not chopped in half, like he got.
You got to keep information out of the gutter too, because depending on the thickness of your book.
Yes, exactly. So there's very specific parameters that you need to use in order to make sure that it actually connects to each other too when they print, because usually there's like a little border.
Well, there can't, again, that's printer sourcing. How they handle their spreads, because some printers are the thing that does a pagination, which is the offset of page 1 will be next to page 22. They'll account for paper thickness and gutter, so they'll adjust the image. They'll start, as it gets more toward the center of the book where more gutter's getting eaten up, they'll start sliding things out like a 32nd of an inch and stuff. So ask your printer what your tolerance is for your gutter allowances, and they'll tell you, we're going to adjust it a 32nd of an inch when we do like a trade and stuff. But communication with your printer is key, I think.
That was a big one.
What was your second thing, real quick?
Let your art breathe. I don't know, for whatever reason, I put so many panels into one page that it got to the point where it was very dense.
And paper stock can only soak up so much ink too. Yeah.
And so it's super dense, lots of black, and you would get these little fades and these weird little art.
Yeah, you can see sometimes you can see the ink through the paper on the other
exactly.
side.
So make sure you're picking the right kind of paper too.
Yeah,
if it's really ink heavy, like mine are.
And then talk to your printer about that. Be like, hey, here's the images. Is that pound of paper?
Yeah. I've always kind of gone thick paper, but I did do one kind of sample, what's it look like with the thinner paper? And then I went, oh my god.
Yeah, it's just bleeding through the other side. So, sorry, we gotta wrap up pretty quick here. So let me give you guys, if you're interested in comic production, 2 things online you can find. There is a zine that came out many years ago, I think early 2000s. It's called, it's like Regarding, it's actually just the letters RE, a guide to reproduction. That's it. And it step by step takes you into how to scan stuff in for bitmap, how to set your color levels, all of this stuff. Literally step by step prepping files. It's the most comprehensive guide out there. Every good comic artist I know has read it at least. You can vary from that. There's a lot of information out there online. It's the best one that I have found. And to that end, the guys, I don't know if you've ever heard of Cartoonist Kayfabe. It's a channel on YouTube. They go through that issue and they talk about all the stuff that's in there. So either find the zine and download it, and then maybe watch Cartoonist Kayfabe go through and talk about it and the importance of it. And then also to Cartoonist Kayfabe, they have an episode with Sean Michael Robinson, who I think runs the Fantagraphics graphics design department. And he goes through, it's like an hour and a half long episode. It's a little bit of interview. You kind of get to know who he is. But at some point, he goes through and he talks about how he scans it, how he adjusts the levels, how he refines edges, all of this stuff that just gets to the point where you would then go to start coloring stuff. It is the most comprehensive step-by-step how to get physical artboard into your computer in the cleanest, nicest way possible. That episode alone is the best thing that channel has ever put out in a very, very good channel. So Cartoonist Kayfabe is a good channel just in general. But that episode with Sean Michael Robinson, highly recommend that episode where they go through the guide to reproduction is also a great episode. So anyone who wants to handle production on their own, highly recommend those 2 episodes. And if you guys have any questions about that or you want me to write it down, I'll be at my booth and I will share that information with anybody. Any last questions before we go? All right, thank you guys so much. What table number are you guys at, or does it? Maybe?
I'm at number 27. I have the one with the big Schizo, the Killer Bear plushie tower. You kind of sit on top.
Bobby, where you at?
I don't know the number, but I'm right in front of Gonzo. If you look through this door, Lucha Libre cat, cocking his fist. That's me. I don't know the number. Sorry.
I think we're number 5. We're very much in the corner by the vending machines, but you can see a big Quince banner and a big fan base.
And I'm across from Javier. So thank you guys so much for joining us. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you guys.